A 61-year-old woman named Teresa came to me 17 months ago. She had been a secondary school librarian for 29 years. Methodical, patient, the kind of woman who had catalogued hundreds of thousands of books with quiet precision, who applied that same precision to her own health management. She had been a type 2 diabetic for 5 years. She took her medication. She checked her blood sugar every morning. She attended every quarterly diabetic review without fail. And she had been experiencing something for 14 months that she had mentioned twice to her GP and once to her diabetic nurse, and had each time received an explanation that she had accepted but that had never felt entirely right. She felt weak after eating. Not faint, not dramatically unwell, a specific, reliable weakness that arrived approximately 40 to 60 minutes after most meals and lasted between 1 and 2 hours, before gradually resolving, a heaviness in her limbs, a difficulty concentrating, a need to sit down that was not tiredness, but something with a different quality, a feeling she described to me as her body withdrawing from her. She had been attributing it to her diabetes. Her GP had confirmed that it was likely related to her blood sugar and had suggested she eat smaller portions. Her diabetic nurse had adjusted her medication timing slightly. Neither change had made a meaningful difference. The weakness continued after every substantial meal with a reliability that she had stopped finding alarming and started finding simply inconvenient, another thing her body did now that it had not done before. She had never been told what was actually happening inside her body when the weakness arrived. She had never been told the name for it. She had never been told that the mechanism producing it was not simply her diabetes behaving badly, but a specific and identifiable physiological sequence with a specific and correctable set of contributing factors. And she had never been told that the weakness itself was a cardiovascular signal as much as a metabolic one, that her heart and her blood vessels were involved in producing it in ways that her diabetic review appointments had never discussed. When I reviewed Teresa's case in full, the picture that assembled itself was one that I recognize immediately and that I see far more frequently than it is diagnosed or explained. She had reactive hypoglycemia compounded by postprandial hypotension, two separate but mechanistically linked post-meal physiological events happening simultaneously in a body whose cardiovascular and metabolic systems had been quietly compromised by years of impaired insulin response and progressive arterial stiffness. The weakness was real. It had a mechanism, and the mechanism had not been explained to her in 14 months of living with it because neither of the separate conditions producing it had been specifically identified, and the interaction between them had not been considered at all. I'm Dr. Kevin Adjual. I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon. I've spent over 30 years operating on hearts, repairing arteries, and sitting with patients who have been living with symptoms that have a clear and specific explanation that nobody has. Taking the time to provide what I'm about to share with you, most doctors won't bring up at your annual checkup. But after 60, it matters more than you think. Today, I am going to explain why you still feel weak after eating. The real reason, the hidden mechanism that most people experiencing this have never been told about. I am going to walk you through exactly what is happening inside your body in the hour after a meal. Why those processes produce weakness in a body over 60 in ways they do not produce it in a younger one. What the specific contributing factors are, and exactly what to do about it. Stay with me, because the mechanism I am going to describe in the middle of this video is the one that connects your post-meal weakness directly to your cardiovascular system. And once you understand that connection, the weakness will never feel like a mystery again. Before I explain the mechanism, I need you to understand something about what eating actually demands from the body that most people have never been told. Because most people think of eating as a passive process. The food arrives, the body receives it. Digestion happens somewhere in the background, and the rest of the body continues with whatever it was doing. That picture is incorrect in a way that is clinically important. Think of it this way. Eating a substantial meal is the equivalent of a moderate physiological demand placed simultaneously on the cardiovascular system, the metabolic system, and the autonomic nervous system. When food enters the stomach and begins moving into the small intestine, the gastrointestinal tract requires a massive increase in blood flow to power the digestive process. The mesenteric vessels, the arteries and veins supplying the intestines, dilate. Blood volume is redirected from other parts of the body toward the gut. The splanchnic circulation, which supplies the digestive organs, receives a surge of blood flow that can account for 30 to 40% of total cardiac output in the post-meal period, compared to approximately 20% at rest before eating. That redirection of blood has to come from somewhere. In a young, healthy cardiovascular system with elastic arteries and a responsive autonomic nervous system, the compensatory mechanisms are fast and efficient. The heart rate increases slightly. The peripheral vessels constrict appropriately to maintain blood pressure. The blood is redistributed without the person noticing anything beyond perhaps a comfortable fullness after a good meal. The system manages the demand seamlessly. After 60, that seamlessness is gone. The arterial walls are stiffer. The autonomic reflexes that manage rapid redistribution of blood volume are slower and less precise. The baroreceptors, the pressure sensors in the aortic arch that detect blood pressure changes and trigger compensatory responses, are less sensitive than they were at 40, and the heart itself, in many adults over 60, has some degree of diastolic dysfunction that reduces its ability to increase output rapidly in response to changing demands. The post-meal blood redistribution that was handled invisibly at 35 is handled visibly, inadequately, and at a cardiovascular cost that shows up as weakness, lightheadedness, difficulty concentrating, and a need to sit down that arrives reliably 40 to 60 minutes after eating. This is postprandial hypotension, a drop in blood pressure after eating that occurs because the blood has moved to the gut, and the cardiovascular system cannot maintain adequate pressure everywhere else simultaneously. Here is what is actually happening inside the body during that window. Systolic blood pressure can fall by 20 millimeters of mercury or more in the 40 to 60 minutes following a substantial meal in adults with postprandial hypotension. That drop is enough to reduce cerebral perfusion measurably. The brain receives less blood per beat than it requires for full function. The muscles, simultaneously receiving less blood than normal as the circulation has prioritized the gastrointestinal tract, have reduced oxygen delivery. The person experiences the brain's response to reduced perfusion as difficulty concentrating, cognitive slowing, a sense of distance or dissociation. They experience the muscle's response to reduced oxygen delivery as heaviness, weakness, and the reluctance of the limbs to respond with their usual reliability. They sit down. The horizontal position reduces the gravitational disadvantage. Blood redistributes. Over 60 to 90 minutes, the post-meal blood flow demand from the gut subsides. Pressure recovers, the weakness lifts, and the person attributes the entire episode to their blood sugar, to their medication, to their diabetes, without ever knowing that their blood pressure was falling and their brain and muscles were transiently underperfused throughout the episode. Research published in the Journal of the American Geriatric Society found that postprandial hypotension affected up to 40% of older adults, with higher prevalence in those with hypertension, diabetes, Parkinson's disease, and autonomic neuropathy. 40% present in nearly half of the older adults most likely to be experiencing post-meal weakness, and in the majority of cases, the condition had not been formally diagnosed because nobody had measured blood pressure before and after a meal. Nobody had put a cuff on the patient 45 minutes after eating and compared the reading to their pre-meal baseline. That is a measurement that takes 5 minutes. It requires a standard blood pressure cuff, and it would, in many cases, immediately explain a symptom that has been attributed to blood sugar for months or years. But postprandial hypotension is only the first part of the mechanism producing Teresa's weakness. The second part operates through an entirely different biological pathway. And this is the part I told you about at the beginning, the part that connects the post-meal weakness to the metabolic system and that produces the specific pattern of weakness that diabetic and pre-diabetic adults over 60 experience with the greatest intensity and the greatest frequency. The second mechanism is reactive hypoglycemia, also called postprandial hypoglycemia, a pattern in which blood sugar rises rapidly after a high glycemic meal, triggers an exaggerated insulin response, and then falls not merely to normal, but below normal. In the 60 to 90 minutes following the meal, the person feels weak, shaky, sweaty, unable to concentrate, and desperate for something sweet. They eat something, the blood sugar rises again. They feel temporarily better. They attribute the episode to their diabetes and assume their management is inadequate. Nobody explains that the episode was triggered by the meal that preceded it, and that the specific character of that meal, its glycemic index, its macronutrient composition, the order in which the food was eaten, was more responsible for the hypoglycemia than any failure of their medication or their willpower. Here's what is actually happening inside the body. In a person with type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance, the pancreatic beta cells do not release insulin at the same speed and precision as in a metabolically healthy adult. The first phase insulin response, the rapid initial release of preformed insulin that blunts the immediate post-meal glucose rise, is impaired. Blood glucose rises higher and faster than it would in a healthy pancreas. The pancreas detects the elevation and releases a larger second phase insulin response to compensate. But because this response is delayed and because it overestimates the glucose load that still needs to be managed by the time it arrives, it drives blood sugar down past the normal range. The hypoglycemia is an overshoot. The glucose was high, the insulin arrived late and in excess, and the result is blood sugar that falls below the threshold, at which the brain and the muscles can function normally. Here is what the brain does when blood sugar falls below approximately 4 millimoles per liter, minus 72 milligrams per deciliter. In the American measurement, the hypothalamus detects the glucose deficit. It activates the sympathetic nervous system as an emergency response. Adrenaline is released. Glucagon is released. The adrenal response produces the shakiness, the palpitations, and the anxiety, the sweating that characterize a hypoglycemic episode in a person who is aware of their blood sugar, but in a person whose hypoglycemic awareness has been blunted, which happens progressively in people who have had repeated mild hypoglycemic episodes, a condition called hypoglycemia. Unawareness, the adrenergic symptoms are absent or reduced. The person does not feel shaky or anxious. They feel weak, cognitively slow, physically heavy, unable to generate the effort that normal activity requires. And they do not reach for the glucose monitor because the episode does not feel like what they have been told hypoglycemia feels like. It feels like the weakness they always feel after eating. It feels like their normal. That distinction between the textbook hypoglycemia of the sweating, shaking, clearly unwell patient and the blunted hypoglycemia of the post-meal weakness that is quiet, gradual, and entirely attributable to something else is the distinction that has kept Teresa's diagnosis from being made for 14 months. Research published in Diabetes Care confirmed that postprandial hypoglycemia was significantly more common in adults with type 2 diabetes and impaired first-phase insulin response than in healthy controls, and that the episodes were frequently asymptomatic by conventional measures while producing measurable impairment in cognitive function and physical performance at blood glucose levels that the standard clinical thresholds for hypoglycemia did not capture. The weakness was real, the blood sugar was low, the symptoms were atypical, and the combination was being attributed to everything except what was actually happening. Let me ask you something directly. Do you feel weak, heavy, foggy, or unable to concentrate in the 40 to 90 minutes after a substantial meal? Does that weakness resolve on its own after an hour or two? Have you attributed it to your diabetes, to your medication, to eating the wrong thing, to simply getting older? And has anyone ever measured your blood pressure 45 minutes after a meal or asked you to check your blood sugar at the moment the weakness is at its worst, rather than at your standard fasting time? Tell me in the comments below, because the number of people experiencing this specific pattern of post-meal weakness who have never had those two measurements taken at the right time is far larger than it should be. And those two measurements, blood pressure mid-meal and blood sugar at peak weakness, are the investigations that explain what is happening in most cases within a single afternoon of deliberate monitoring. Now, I want to address the third mechanism, because for some adults over 60, the post-meal weakness has a third contributing element that operates independently of both blood pressure and blood sugar, and that is consistently overlooked because it is a newer area of clinical understanding that has not yet been fully integrated into standard diabetic or cardiovascular review conversations. The third mechanism is impaired postprandial mitochondrial function, secondary to chronic systemic inflammation. This is the mechanism that explains why some adults over 60 feel weak after eating, even when their blood pressure is maintained and their blood sugar does not significantly drop, and why the weakness is specifically worse after larger meals, worse in the afternoon than in the morning, and worse on days when they have been under stress or have slept poorly. Here is what is actually happening inside the body. The post-meal period is a time of significant metabolic demand at the cellular level. The cells, particularly the muscle cells and the neurons that support cognitive function, must process the incoming nutrients, produce ATP at an increased rate to support the digestive process and the moderate physical activity of the post-meal period, and manage the oxidative burden of the metabolic activity that follows eating. In a cell with healthy mitochondria operating in a low inflammation environment, that demand is met efficiently. ATP is produced. The cell functions normally. The person feels no weakness. In a cell operating in the context of chronic low-grade systemic inflammation, elevated CRP, elevated interleukin-6, elevated tumor necrosis factor alpha, the mitochondria are already suppressed below their optimal output capacity by the same inflammatory cytokines that I described in the context of fatigue in a previous video. When the post-meal metabolic demand arrives on top of that already suppressed mitochondrial capacity, the cell cannot meet the demand. ATP production is insufficient for the combined requirements of normal cellular function and post-meal metabolic processing. The person experiences this as a specific meal-triggered energy failure, a weakness that is real, that is cellular, and that is driven by the inflammatory environment rather than by the meal itself. This mechanism explains why the same meal produces more weakness on a high-stress day than on a calm one. Cortisol amplifies systemic inflammation and further suppresses mitochondrial efficiency. It explains why the weakness is worse in the afternoon. The cumulative inflammatory burden of the day compresses mitochondrial reserve progressively as hours pass. And it explains why improving sleep quality, reducing visceral adiposity, and addressing the sources of chronic inflammation, periodontal disease, gut dysbiosis, metabolic syndrome, produces an improvement in post-meal energy that feels disproportionate to what should result from those changes alone. Because those changes are not simply reducing inflammation, they are releasing mitochondrial capacity that the inflammation was suppressing. Research published in Nature Metabolism confirmed that chronic systemic inflammation directly impairs mitochondrial electron transport chain efficiency in skeletal muscle, and that the degree of impairment was proportional to the inflammatory marker levels in the same individuals. The muscle cells of inflamed adults were producing less ATP for the same nutrient input. The weakness was not from inadequate nutrition, it was from inadequate cellular energy production, despite adequate nutrition. The food was arriving. The factory was not converting it efficiently, and the factory's inefficiency was driven by the inflammatory environment in which it was operating. A high-sensitivity CRP test, a single blood draw that is part of most standard blood panels and that costs very little, will tell you whether your systemic inflammatory burden is in the range where mitochondrial suppression becomes a clinically relevant contributor to your post-meal weakness. A CRP above 2 mg per liter in the context of post-meal weakness warrants a systematic conversation with your doctor about the sources of that inflammation and the interventions most likely to reduce it. Now let me give you the plan. Because I've described 3 mechanisms: postprandial hypotension, reactive hypoglycemia, and inflammatory mitochondrial suppression. And all 3 are addressable. None of them requires a new prescription as the first intervention. All of them respond to specific, targeted behavioral and dietary changes that begin today. I call this the post-meal strength protocol. 5 steps starting this week. Step 1. Measure your blood pressure before and 45 minutes after your next substantial meal. Sit quietly for 5 minutes before each measurement. If your systolic falls by 20 millimeters of mercury or more in the fat post-meal measurement compared to the pre-meal one, you have identified postprandial hypotension as a contributor to your weakness. Bring both readings to your next GP or cardiologist appointment and ask specifically whether postprandial hypotension has been considered as a diagnosis. That conversation cannot happen unless you provide the data. The data requires a cuff and 45 minutes. Both are available to you today. Step 2. Check your blood sugar at the moment of maximum weakness, not fasting, not 2 hours post-meal by the standard protocol, but precisely when the weakness is at its worst, which in most cases is between 40 and 90 minutes after eating. Write down the time, the reading, and what you ate. If the reading is below 4.0 millimoles per liter by minus 72 milligrams per deciliter at that moment, you have captured a reactive hypoglycemic episode. That data, taken to your diabetic nurse or GP, changes the management conversation from generalized blood sugar control to meal composition and insulin response timing. It is the difference between adjusting medication and adjusting the meal, but is triggering the medication's overshoot. Step 3. Change the composition and sequence of your meals. This is the single most powerful intervention for both postprandial hypotension and reactive hypoglycemia and requires no prescription, no referral, and no equipment. Eat protein and vegetables first, carbohydrate last. Research from the Weill Cornell Medical Center confirmed that eating protein and fat before carbohydrate at the same meal reduces the post-meal glucose peak by 28 to 37% compared to eating the same foods in the opposite order, directly reducing the exaggerated insulin response that produces the reactive hypoglycemic overshoot. Include fat in every meal. Fat slows gastric emptying, the rate at which food moves from the stomach into the small intestine. And this single change slows the blood redistribution to the gut that produces postprandial hypotension. When food moves into the intestine more slowly, the mesenteric blood flow demand rises more, gradually, giving the cardiovascular compensatory mechanisms time to respond without the blood pressure falling. Eat smaller, more frequent meals rather than 2 or 3 large ones. The magnitude of postprandial hypotension and reactive hypoglycemia both correlate directly with meal size. Larger meals produce larger blood flow demands and larger insulin responses. Distributing the same food across smaller, more frequent meals reduces the peak of each event without reducing the total nutritional intake. Step 4. Walk for 10 to 15 minutes immediately after eating rather than sitting or lying down. This is the recommendation that requires the most explanation because it feels counterintuitive. If the weakness is already present after meals, the impulse is to rest. But gentle movement after eating activates the muscle pump in the legs, which returns venous blood from the lower body to the heart, partially counteracting the blood redistribution to the gut and helping maintain peripheral blood pressure. It also activates glucose transport into the skeletal muscle through an insulin-independent pathway, specifically through GLUT4 translocation driven by muscle contraction, directly absorbing post-meal glucose without requiring the insulin surge that triggers the hypoglycemic overshoot. A 10-minute walk after eating reduces post-meal glucose peaks by a clinically significant margin in diabetic adults. And it maintains peripheral circulation in the face of the mesenteric blood flow demand that would otherwise produce postprandial hypotension. The walk is not incidental. It is the physiological intervention that addresses both mechanisms simultaneously. Step 5. Request a high-sensitivity CRP test at your next blood panel. If it is above 2 mg per liter, discuss with your doctor what the most likely sources of that inflammation are in your specific clinical context. Dental disease, gut dysbiosis, visceral adiposity, uncontrolled blood sugar contributing to age-mediated vascular inflammation. Each of those has a specific and addressable intervention. Reducing systemic inflammation does not produce immediate relief from post-meal weakness. It produces gradual, progressive improvement over 8 to 12 weeks as mitochondrial function is released from inflammatory suppression and the cellular capacity to meet post-meal metabolic demand is restored. That restoration is not dramatic, it is incremental, and it requires measuring the starting point with a CRP so that the direction of travel can be confirmed with a repeat measurement at 12 weeks. I want to come back to Teresa. After her blood pressure was measured before and 45 minutes after a standard lunch, the meal that most reliably produced her weakness, her systolic had fallen from 134 pre-meal to 109 post-meal, a 25-point drop, postprandial hypotension. Her blood sugar, checked at the moment of maximum weakness 50 minutes after the meal, was 3.6 millimoles per liter, below the threshold at which the brain and muscles can function optimally. Reactive hypoglycemia. Her high-sensitivity CRP was 3.9 milligrams per liter, minus elevated, indicating systemic inflammatory burden contributing to mitochondrial suppression. 3 mechanisms, all 3 present simultaneously, all 3 producing weakness through separate pathways, all 3 identifiable with measurements that took 1 afternoon and cost essentially nothing beyond the blood draw. She made 3 changes. She restructured her meals, protein and vegetables first, smaller portions more frequently, fat included at every meal to slow gastric emptying. She began a 10-minute walk after every main meal, and she addressed her periodontal disease, identified as the primary source of her elevated CRP, through a course of dental treatment over 6 weeks. At her 8-week review, her post-meal blood pressure drop had reduced from 25 points to 11 points, still present but no longer at the threshold, producing significant symptoms. Her reactive hypoglycemic episodes had essentially stopped her. Post-meal glucose was landing between 6.1 and 7.8, rather than the 3.6 that had been producing the weakness. Her CRP had fallen from 3.9 to 1.8 following the dental treatment. The weakness after meals had reduced from a daily, debilitating pattern to an occasional and mild event that no longer required her to sit down and wait it out. She came back to see me 3 months after those changes. She sat across from me with the particular quality of a person who has recovered something they had accommodated losing. She said the most useful thing had not been the protocol. It had been the explanation. She said I had been told it was my diabetes for 14 months, just my diabetes. She shook her head slightly, and then she said the thing that has stayed with me ever since. She said, it was my blood pressure and my blood sugar and my inflammation all happening at the same time after every meal. She looked at me, and then she said, Nobody measured any of them at the right time. They measured them in the morning and told me the morning numbers were fine. The weakness happened in the afternoon. She paused. And then she said simply, "No, the measurement has to happen when the symptom is happening." That is the most important sentence in this entire video. The measurement has to happen when the symptom is happening. Not at the standard testing time, not at the routine review appointment, at the moment of the symptom, with the data from that moment brought to the clinical encounter that can interpret it. Let me say each mechanism one final time. Postprandial hypotension, blood pressure falling after eating, because blood has redistributed to the gut and the cardiovascular system cannot maintain adequate pressure elsewhere simultaneously. Measurable with a blood pressure cuff 45 minutes after a meal, addressable with smaller meals, fat at every meal, and a 10-minute walk afterward. Reactive hypoglycemia, blood sugar falling below the normal range after a high glycemic meal because the delayed insulin response overshoots the glucose that remains by the time it arrives. Measurable with a glucose monitor at the moment of maximum weakness, addressable with protein-first meal sequencing. Smaller portions and post-meal movement. An inflammatory mitochondrial suppression, cellular energy production impaired by chronic systemic inflammation, reducing the mitochondria's ability to meet the post-meal metabolic demand. Measurable with a high sensitivity CRP, addressable by identifying and treating the sources of inflammation, dental disease, gut dysbiosis, visceral adiposity, uncontrolled blood sugar, 3 mechanisms, 3 measurements, 3 specific interventions, and 1 symptom that has been living under the wrong explanation for far too long in far too many people. Which of these 3 mechanisms do you recognize in your own post-meal pattern? Is the weakness cardiovascular worse when you stand after eating, better when you lie down? Is it metabolic worse after high carbohydrate meals accompanied by sugar craving as it resolves? Or is it inflammatory worse in the afternoon, worse on stress days, worse after poor sleep? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And your answers tell me how many people are living with a mechanism that has been named but never explained. If this video gave you something that changes what you measure and when you measure it, share it. Not for me. For the person in your life who sits down after every meal and calls it their diabetes or their age, who has stopped expecting the weakness to have an explanation because 4 appointments produce 4 explanations, then none of them quite fit. They may not know that the measurement has to happen when the symptom is happening. But you do now, and that is exactly why you are here. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do. Every week I bring you honest, evidence-based information that I wish every one of my patients had access to long before they needed surgery. Take care of your heart. It has been working for you every single minute of every single day without asking for anything in return. Give it what it needs. It is a fair trade. One last thing, and this is important. Everything I have shared today is general medical information based on published research and my clinical experience as a cardiac surgeon. It is not a substitute for your personal medical care. Please do not make changes to your medications or your prescribed management plan without speaking to your own physician first. They know your history. They know your clinical picture. I do not. This is education. Use it as the beginning of that conversation, the conversation that Teresa wishes someone had started with her 14 months earlier.